Hello students, welcome to ePathshala. My name is Ashima Gupta and I am an assistant professor in Government College for Girls, Sector 42, Chandigarh. This paper is going to tell you certain things about the concept of civilization. A student of international relations is likely to come across a range of concepts such as power, equality and justice. He is most likely to study certain events like World War I, World War II, Cold War and War on Terror. He also studies concepts such as terrorism and civilization. This paper specifically deals with civilization, which came into forefront of international relations with the publishing of Clash of Civilization thesis of Samuel P. Huntington. In this particular thesis, he argued that all the future conflicts in the world will be on the basis of civilization, and he said that there are 8 major civilizations in the world. In simple words, civilization is a concept or a process in which individuals or a group of individuals learn to make the best use of their surrounding resources and apply science and technology in the day-to-day life. This paper will tell us about the significance of this particular thesis and the criticism it attracted when it actually came out. Objectives: to describe the theme of civilization in international politics, to know about civilization as a guide to foreign policy, to explain the Huntington theory of clash of civilizations, discussion on what constitutes a civilization, how many civilizations are there, how can they be classified in international politics. Civilization and the study of international politics. Civilizations received increasing attention from scholars of international politics after Samuel P. Huntington published an article entitled Clash of Civilizations in Foreign Affairs Journals in 1993. The major contention in the Huntington's thesis is the assumption that in the emerging era, the greatest threat to world peace would be the clash of civilization, and the surest safeguard against world war would be an international order based on civilizations. We study civilizations when a lot of attention is paid to the potential of civilizations to guide foreign policy of nation by international politics scholars. We study it to evaluate whether civilizations have any role in comprehending international politics or if they have the power to guide foreign policy of nations belonging to various civilizations. We study civilizations in international politics by understanding what are civilizations. It means taking into account the various definitions of civilizations, how civilizations are classified, understanding the thesis that brought the study of civilization into international politics, the reactions it received, and the ongoing research on civilizations within international politics. The word civilization officially emerged for the first time in print in the 18th century France, 1756 to be precise, in the work entitled A Treatise on Population by Victor de Requete, Marquis de Mirabeau. After this formal entry, civilization meant broadly the opposite of barbarism. To civilize was to polish the manners, to make civil and sociable. From France, the word civilization soon travelled to England, Germany, Holland and Italy, spreading over the whole of Europe, accompanied by the word culture. Both civilization and culture were used interchangeably till as late as 1830, when Hegel used them indistinguishably at the University of Berlin. Civilization is a developed form of culture for the classical evolutionists, who believe that culture or society has passed through 3 successive stages of development in sequence, namely savagery, barbarism and civilization. Huntington, on the other hand, describes civilization as a cultural entity with commonalities existing at a broader level. It has both common objective elements like history, language, religion, custom, etc. When civilizations are at their peak or apex, it has been observed that they consider themselves superior, sophisticated, and advanced in literature, language, culture, system of society, manners, architecture, and politics. The Greek referred to the population living beyond their borders as barbaric in comparison to their superior sophisticated and civilized self. The Western civilization have been interpreted to colonize the rest of the world in the name of civilizing them through the Christian missionaries under white man's burden. How many civilizations are there? At different points in history, it is argued different civilizations have emerged, evolved and disappeared once they have achieved their apex and slowly decayed after invasion by a new and powerful civilization. Some such civilizations have been ancient Greece, ancient Near East, Aztec, Byzantine, Persian, Roman, Ottoman, Swahili, Vikings, Islamic, Indus, Maya, Mesopotamian civilization, etc. Classification of civilizations. Civilizations can be classified based on some specific criteria. Some can be distinguished based on their appearance in history, like Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Indus, the Asian civilization, etc., which came prior to the others and which is the universal civilization in present times. Others can be classified based on the existence of a group of civilizations in a specific century or period in history, while still others can be classified thematically. It has been observed by scholars that Samuel P. Huntington in his thesis did not mention the criteria for his classification of civilizations. The 8 civilizations that Huntington identified were Western, Cynic, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and possibly African civilization. Clash of civilization thesis. The last decade of 20th century witnessed the decline of Soviet Union. Studies in international relations at this critical juncture witnessed many explanations of the emerging world order, one of which was the clash of civilization thesis. Post-Cold War world order. The salient feature of post-Cold War world order was its unipolarity. Clinton even propounded an intervention thesis where the threat to life and security of a sizable group of people could lead to intervention with or without the UN support. Even Western Europe went along and United Nations lost a good deal of its prestige. Within this atmosphere, various explanations and theses that emerged to explain the collapse of Soviet Union and the emerging world order also tried to explain what the future would be like, and unavoidable, they looked at culture and civilization for explanation. This latter variation of studies in civilization in international relations started from a small spark started by Bernard Lewis in 1989. Which spread like wildfire after 1993 when Samuel P. Huntington painted the future in his journal article Clash of Civilizations. The thesis proposed by Huntington shook the academic world and took the world by storm when he envisaged the imminent clash between civilizations in a world bereaved of ideological confrontations between capitalism and communism. What does clash mean? The term clash generally has connotation of differences which has the potential to lead to oppositions. Major arguments in clash of civilization thesis. Let us begin with the perceived reasons for the clash among civilizations. Reason for the clash. Huntington lucidly points out that one civilization as a whole will not clash with another. The 8 civilizations, he argued, will clash through the core nation states of each civilization. Nation states, he argues, were recent developments, and even though they will be the most powerful actors in world affairs, civilizations will clash and reinforce conflicts at 2 levels. At micro level, where adjacent groups along the fault lines will struggle violently over control of territory and each other, and at macro level, where states from different civilizations will compete for relative military and economic power to promote their political and religious values. He lists 6 reasons for the imminent clash of civilization. First, in a time and space compressed globalizing world, contact between different civilizations will make people conscious and aware of differences between civilizations and commonalities within civilizations. Second, the basic differences in history, language, culture, and most importantly in religion will generate prolonged and most violent conflict. Third, unsecularization of the world and revival of religion will provide basis for identity and commitment that transcends national boundaries and unites civilizations. Fourth, conflict will arise also when the West at the peak of power confronts non-West that increasingly has the desire, will and resources to shape the world in non-Western ways. Fifth, he argues that while there is a choice that can be made in class and ideological conflicts, civilizational identity is pre-given and cannot be changed. To quote him, even more than ethnicity, religion discriminates sharply and exclusively among people. Sixth, and increasing economic regionalism will reinforce civilization consciousness. He also points out that it cannot be denied that culture and religion also forms the basis for economic cooperation organizations. The fading of the West and indigenization. He recognizes three major characteristics of the declining West. It will be a slow process. The decline would not proceed in a straight line, and West's share of resources would decline in terms of population, territory, economic product, and military capability. Indigenization takes place as a form of reassertion, Huntington asserts. And as for religious resurgence, he argues it is nothing but a reaction against secularism, moral relativism, and self-indulgence, and a reaffirmation of the values of order, discipline, work, mutual help, and human solidarity. The challenger civilization. The second most significant factor for the clash of civilizations Huntington identifies is the rise of two culturally assertive challenger civilizations, namely Islam and Asia. Discussing the causes behind these challenges, he states that Asian assertiveness is rooted in economic growth and Muslim assertiveness stems from the social mobilization and population growth, and each of them will have destabilizing impact on global politics. The politics of identity. With the end of Cold War, Huntington asserts throughout the world countries began to develop new and reinvigorated old antagonisms and affiliations. Huntington provides 5 reasons for why cultural commonality will facilitate cooperation and cohesion among people, and cultural differences will promote cleavages and conflicts. The process of othering, the civilizational us and the extra civilizational them, is a constant in human history which stems out of feeling of superiority, fear of and lack of trust, difficulty of communication, and lack of familiarity, where the people are perceived as others, which leads to deeper consciousness of civilizational differences and of the need to protect what distinguishes us from them. Cultural questions involve a zero-sum game, and sources of conflict between different civilizations are control of people, territory, wealth, and resources, and their relative power to impose one's own values, culture, and institutions on another group, where there is no scope for a compromise. The us versus them dichotomy in the era after Cold War has come, he argues, to be defined by the cultural identities, and the ubiquity of conflict on these lines is based on the human tendency to hate and need for enemies for self-definition and motivation. The West's role in future. Concerned with the revival of the West, he mentions that the health of the West is faced with not just economic and demographic problems but also moral decline, cultural suicide, and political disunity. And he is of the opinion that the future of the West and United States is dependent on Americans to reform their commitment to Western civilization, as without USA, the West will be reduced to Europe and few slightly populated overseas areas with European settler countries. Lack of technical precision. Among the technical glitches, major puzzling questions were directed at the list of civilizations drawn by Huntington, which was described by Kirkpatrick as a strange list, as Latin America is as much a part of West as is North America. The criteria prescribed and utilized by Huntington for demarcating the civilizations was also not clear. where some civilizations were labeled by their major religious identity like Slavic Orthodox, Islamic, Hindu and Buddhists, others were labeled by their continental identity like Latin American and African, and still others were merely known by their culture like Confucian and geographical identity, invigorated by colonial superiority like Western civilization. Some scholars quizzed the thesis about the strength of a civilizational identity to decide the action on the world stage. Civilizations throughout history have always been recognized as vague entities not capable of driving political, economic, or military relationships and clashes. There were some scholars who questioned the existence of mutually exclusive civilizations. Edward Said also drew attention to the misleading role of labels like West and Islam that confuse the mind and avoid critical understanding of the bewildering interdependence of our time. By reinforcing defensive self-pride and primitive passions that draw boundaries not only between West and Islam but also between past and present, us and them, and concepts like identity and nationality, which are shrouded in unending disagreement and debate. Civilizations versus nation state. Among the reactions that Huntington received, one of the major themes on which he was brutally challenged was that it is the nation states which have been and will continue to dominate the international scene and not civilizations. National interests and desire for enhancing national power will drive most of the national states and not abstract entities like civilizations, the scholars argued. He emphatically continues that for the students of history and culture, civilization has always seemed a messy creature. Jean J. Kirkpatrick refers to civilizational claims of being real and important and culture being the source of conflict as interesting but dubious propositions. Weeks allege that Huntington's methodology is not new. Toynbee categorized civilizations into primary, secondary, and tertiary civilizations by the time of their appearance in history, and which, according to him, continued to influence contemporary events. Sources of conflicts: politics, economics, and geopolitics. In the post-Cold War era, it is the conflicts of economic and political interests that are becoming more common and tense among the nations of the world, and neither civilization nor culture has become the fundamental source of conflict in this new world, contends Liu Binyan. Clash within civilizations. Intra-civilizational conflicts. Responding to cynic confusion unity, Liu Binyan states that there is nowhere in China a group or political faction that could be likened to the extreme nationalists of Russia or Europe. He also points out that if political nationalism is not acting like a cohesive bond, there seems to be a lack even in the civilizational quarter. Mahbubani perceives that since the attack on the World Trade Center, the Americans have come to absorb the European paranoia about Islam, which is perceived as a force of darkness hovering over a virtuous Christian civilization. Islamic confusion connection. Said points out that the lion's share of his attention is directed at Islam due to the persisting legacy of monotheism, that is, the Abrahamic religions, where beginning with Judaism and Christianity. Mahbubani makes another interesting observation that the West is conjuring up images of the two Asian hordes that Western minds fear the most, two forces that invaded Europe, the Muslims and the Mongols. Immigration and multiculturalism. Binyan focuses on the wave of immigration from poor nations to the rich countries, and even within the nations from poor territories to the cities, which the UN Population Fund has called the current crisis of mankind. From this he concludes that this can hardly qualify or can be said to result from conflict between different nations. Hence, it can be argued that immigration will continue for better standards of living, and even though this contact may cause friction and breed contempt due to experience of varying or alternate way of life, it will most definitely not lead to a clash of civilizations, as one civilization, as geographically situated, will have various civilizations and cultures living together within it. Modernity and secularism. There are scholars who point out the power of modernity that is being undervalued and underestimated by Huntington in his thesis when he claims that the world would clash on civilizational lines. Hence, the desire for economic development is dragging the rest into accepting the political development model of the West. And the desire for prosperity at the cost of traditional values and systems is not going down well with the rest, but this does not imply that the rest will declare war on the West. There are some scholars who felt the need of the hour is not to find reasons for who will confront whom, or what will be the cause of conflict and war in near future, but be able to overcome these impediments to achieve a larger goal, that is, the lesson of coexistence and also enrichment of the human spirit. Responses in the last decade, 2002 to 2012. Huntington's thesis, having faced the extreme initial reactions and responses, settled down like all other theses, giving way to newer ideas and theses, but it slowly gained prominence once again in the academic field in the last decade due to a few factors. His thesis attained most attention after the attack on World Trade Center in 2001, which was seen as the plausible realization of his thesis, and this idea has lodged itself in the contemporary imagination, functioning as an increasingly influential idea in the media and political circles. In the last decade, it was also revisited and used as explanations of the world scenario in view of the war on terror declared by America on the terrorists across the globe. Many scholars accepting Huntington's argument that Islamic civilization will clash with the West supported intervention in West Asian countries to weed out terrorists who pose as a threat to Western interests. Reactions from within and without. Among the many substantial responses Huntington's thesis generated in the last decade, some stood out prominently. While there were responses and reactions that came from outside the clash of civilizations paradigm, where scholars reacted to his thesis, avoiding the civilizational arguments per se, there were some scholars who reacted to his thesis from within the paradigm, using the civilizations argument, sometimes even accepting the existence of the 7 to 8 civilizations identified by Huntington. Studies within the clash of civilization paradigm. Among the many responses the clash of civilization thesis received, there has been an increasing scholarship on understanding international law and terrorism within the clash of civilizations paradigm. These scholars have made attempts to study terrorism and international humanitarian law within the clash of civilization paradigm, arguing that Huntington's stated reason for the inevitable clash are ambiguous. The empirical study draws attention to the inconsistencies in Huntington's hypothesis while examining terrorism from within the clash of civilizations paradigm. Even though the scholars don't necessarily agree with Huntington's hypothesis, they agree with him on the existence of the civilizations which are identified by Huntington. Hence, the study, which appeared in the initial part of the last decade, tried to comprehend international relations from within the clash of civilizations paradigm. And even though it strongly argued for the need to recognize the conversation between civilizations, not the clash between them, it accepted the interplay and exchanges between civilizations as having the capacity to direct international dynamics. Reactions from outside the clash of civilizations paradigm. Critiques of clash of civilization. In 2003, Syed argued that with the end of Cold War, the defense industry executives in the US and Pentagon were in search of a new enemy to pursue their vocation, and the countries that were using political Islam to attack US imperialism became natural candidates in this search. Noam Chomsky also argued on similar lines in his lecture Militarism, Democracy and People's Right to Information, where he argued that the clash of civilization thesis was as just a new justification for the United States for any atrocities that they wanted to carry out. which was required after the Cold War as the Soviet Union was no longer a viable threat. Huntington stresses is an intellectual serving the interests of the last superpower whose preeminence as a world power he is set on serving and maintaining. Alternate paradigms to clash of civilizations. The critiques of Huntington's thesis have charged his work ambitious, inconsistent, and sometimes self-contradictory, and also argue that there were actors other than civilizations that direct the international relations dynamics in the decade after the end of Cold War. The Clash of Globalization, 2002. Stanley Hoffman, for one, argued in early part of the decade that it was clash of globalization that was governing the international scene and not Huntington's civilizations which were hazy. Critiquing Huntington's thesis, he states that he had not only failed to take into account conflicts within each so-called civilization, but he also overestimated the importance of religion in the behavior of non-Western elites, who are often secularized and westernized. The clash of emotions, fear, humiliation and hope. The clash of emotions, fear, humiliation, hope and the New World Order by Dominique Moisy that appeared in 2007 argued that events since publication of Clash of Civilizations thesis have proved Huntington's vision more right than wrong. Clash of public theologies. Among the most recent paradigms to be presented as an alternative clash is the Clash of Public Theologies by Nuket Ahu Sandel in 2012, where she argues in her article The Clash of Public Theologies, Rethinking the Concept of Religion in Global Politics, that where religion might be conceptually ambivalent, a public theology framework with substantive spiritual, spatial and temporal dimensions can provide a sounder theorization of peaceful, violent or exclusive, inclusive strands of faith traditions and the relationship among them. Conclusions on the thesis. After taking into account the various reactions to Huntington's thesis, it becomes apparent that most scholars don't perceive any civilizational clash, as there is no empirical evidence to justify or test such claim. Martin Griffiths also notes that Huntington's thesis was critiqued as an oversimplification. The list of civilizations considered somehow incorrect or inaccurate, the evidence as anecdotal with room for counter-examples and thesis having many contradictions within it. Another important aspect that he records is the argument that Huntington's thesis was really a surrogate for religion, where he develops an elaborate thesis to say that religion is important in international relations while overtly avoiding the use of the term religion. But in spite of these inaccuracies, he states his arguments as his desire to mold American foreign policy in a particular way comes in the way. Relationship between civilizations. History is witness to heavy and complex borrowings by civilizations from their counterparts. There is invariably some interaction in terms of trade, politics and travel that lead to contact, communication, commerce, commutation, conversion and change. Clash also has been a part of the interactions between civilizations, but it must be borne in mind that it never took place in isolation. Clash alone was not the only form of interaction. Study of civilizations in contemporary international politics. Even if civilizations were not accepted as the major actors on the international scene, the Clash of Civilization thesis generated a lot of interest in the need for a dialogue among civilizations for a more peaceful and just world order. Their major argument is that in spite of the frequent usage of dialogue among civilizations as an antithesis to the popularized thesis of the Clash of Civilization, it remained largely unexplored by the academic community. To summarize, we can say that after the collapse of Soviet Union in 1980s, various scholars were trying to understand the type of world which will emerge after it. One of the famous theses during this time was that of Francis Fukuyama, in which he said that the conflict between capitalism and communism has terminated and all the wars and all the countries are going to move towards democratization of their politics. In response to this, or specifically related to this, Huntington published his thesis on Clash of Civilization, in which he precisely argued that all the wars will take for identity.